Hi, my name is Jamila Hyder, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about traps and surprise as an outcome or phenomena from complex adaptive systems. A characteristic of complex adaptive systems is that micro-level changes of behavior can lead to macro-level phenomena, and traps are an example of such a phenomena. And traps are quite intuitive in the sense that they can be conceptualized or thought of as any undesirable condition that's quite difficult to get out of. So think of a fish trap, for example. They've also been used quite commonly with the term poverty traps within development practice and discourse. And within development, poverty traps are a common term that are described as any type of undesirable persistent situation that commonly exists under a certain asset threshold. And what that means is that it's a self-reinforcing cycle of poverty underneath a threshold such as $1 a day or $2 a day. In order to overcome that threshold, often a big push of some sort of investment is required, and a virtuous cycle of development can begin, is what the theory says. So poverty traps have become quite popularized through books such as The Bottom Billion by Paul Collier or The End of Poverty by Jeffrey Sachs. Poverty traps have also been increasingly used in sustainability science. And within sustainability science, we use the term slightly more broadly as this undesirable persistent situation with, for example, low connectivity and little potential to overcome this undesirable situation. And on the flip side of that, rigidity traps have been used to describe situations that are the opposite of poverty traps. So where things become too overly connected and therefore become vulnerable to shock or and may therefore collapse. So some industrial scale farming, such as some monocultures, could be an example of this, where the system has been optimized for a certain type of production, but is therefore also vulnerable to collapse because of its over or hyperconnectivity. And relatedly, gilded traps have been used to describe a special type of social trap in which collective actions resulting from economically attractive opportunities outweigh concerns over associated social and ecological risks or consequences. So for example, we can look at the Maine lobster fishery, where an unsustainable fishery, which was maximized for economic gain, resulted in a decline of ecological complexity and biodiversity around the American lobster, which created a very vulnerable situation which was viable to collapse. And so the suggested way out of a gilded trap is to increase the diversity of both livelihoods and biodiversity. And a final type of trap that I'll introduce is a social ecological trap, where some type of social dynamics, such as poverty, and ecological dynamics, such as degradation, are self-reinforcing. Consider a situation, perhaps, where in a case of extreme poverty, farmers don't have the choice to allow their land to fallow, but need to till that land year after year, therefore increasing degradation, and which in turn increases poverty. That's been documented in certain situations like in the Sahel, for example, but in other contexts where there's maybe richer biological and cultural diversity, that may not be true. So as we've seen here, traps are used in many different ways across many different fields, both in practice and in theory. So I led a review along with some colleagues to understand how traps have been characterized across different research areas and what are common characteristics and mechanisms of traps. And we wanted to know this because if we understand the mechanisms of traps, it's also easier or clearer on how we could think about appropriate interventions. So we found that traps across the different fields described as undesirable, persistent, and self-reinforcing. But the development economics definition of whether or not traps exist under a certain asset threshold is quite unique to development economics and may not be as applicable when studying sustainability issues, for example. So in addition to these basic conditions of reinforcing, persistent, and undesirable, we suggest 4 more attributes to broaden our conceptualization of traps. So these are cross-scale dynamics and interactions, to incorporate and understand whether social ecological diversity is increasing or decreasing, and then 2 related factors. What are the external factors that may be influencing the trap, and what are path dependencies? So for example, rather than just accepting that a trap a poverty trap exists because of self-reinforcing dynamics, actually understanding perhaps the colonial legacies that may have led to that trap. So we've seen how understanding micro-level behavior can help us understand complex macro-level phenomena such as traps, which is all about a persistent situation which is undesirable and staying the same. On the flip side of this are unexpected shifts or social or ecological surprise, which is what we'll hear about in the second half of this chapter. Thank you.
I'm Gary Peterson. I'm a professor at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and today I'm going to talk about ecological surprise, especially in the Anthropocene. Why would we be worried about ecological surprise in the Anthropocene? Well, surprises happen all the time in nature, but right now we're transforming the planet at an ever-increasing rate. We're changing the way it functions in terms of its speed that it's operating, in terms of making new connections between different places, and in terms of making novel connections between different places. And we expect all of these to produce new types of surprise and to increase the occurrence of surprises that we know about. One of the ways we know that these things are likely to produce new types of surprise is that in the early period of the Anthropocene, as we just were starting to really rapidly transform the planet, we experienced many types of surprise. These often were things that where people were transforming ecosystems to grow more food, to provide a more stable environment to live. Ecosystems responded in ways that people didn't expect. And during the rapid development of the 20th century, saw a lot of things where things people were doing to make human life better ended up making life more difficult or worse for some people. And just a few of the examples to think about are things like a very well-known one is when people develop pesticides. They most famously DDT to control mosquitoes. People thought that was great. However, DDT rapidly created resistance in populations it was sprayed on, making it less effective, and ended up bioaccumulating through food chains, disrupting the reproductive success of all sorts of birds, leading to decline in all these bird species around the world, which people didn't like for both practical and cultural reasons. This meant that, say, growing more food would eliminate the fishery downstream due to nutrient pollution, or spraying pesticides to control agricultural pests would lead to the evolution of a new agricultural pest that destroyed more food and required more control, or that attempts to increase food production through irrigation led to the emergence of novel types of disease that blinded millions of people. So these types of surprises are basically due to people, schemes not knowing or not considering the evolving and diverse nature of ecosystems, but also that our society is creating new connections between different parts of nature and different parts of societies. So it's also these kind of social ecological connections can reduce collapse. People have sort of begun to realize how tightly coupled the world's food and energy systems are, as we had these huge spikes in food prices in 2008 that were related to the rapid rise in oil price that led to all sorts of cascading effects around the world of social disruption and unrest as food prices went up very rapidly and then crashed, and now are in this period of instability. So what this is saying is that both in local places, policies can transform ecosystems in ways that they're difficult to recover from in unexpected ways, and that events that are far away and not even related to something that people are working on, like food production, say changes in oil price, can have an impact on local people's lives. So understanding these surprises presents real challenges. So as probably you're aware, the Arctic is one of the places that's experiencing really substantial change. And this change is driven by changes in governments, changes in resource extraction, but especially by climate change, because the Arctic is experiencing basically double the rate of climate change than the rest of the world, and in some places even more than that. And this is transforming life in the Arctic, often in ways that maybe people in retrospect would not find surprising. But when they occur, it's a really big shock, not just for scientists, but for the individuals who live in these landscapes and the systems they've built up to live there, the bridges, the highways, and the roads. So one very recent example of this is the Yukon River, which went from being a 1,000+ kilometer long river flowing from Canada through Alaska to a river that just flows through Canada and is hundreds of kilometers shorter. This is as permafrost and ice were melting in the Arctic. This allowed the river to change its course, and over a period of a few days, this river went away. So this is something that people were thinking could occur, but didn't know could occur until it actually occurred. And now all the fisheries, the infrastructure that depended on that river being there is now having to respond to this change. So when we looked in the Arctic, this is just one of 19 types of tipping points we saw in the Arctic, which are all producing these types of surprise. Some of them are occurring more locally, some of them are occurring more regionally, some of them are driven by climate change, or most of them are driven by climate change, but some of them are also driven by things like hunting practices, reindeer grazing, other types of land management activity, and they're affecting many different things. As I was pointing out with this river example, they're affecting the stability of the ecosystem, affecting the ability of people to live there and to hunt, to fish. They're affecting the stability of the climate. And in many places where people live, they're actually, by destroying the land, they're destroying the sort of cultural heritage and the ways of life people have built up there for centuries. And these consequences are, of course, being driven by not by what people do in the Arctic, but largely by the industrial economy, fossil fuel burning in the rest of the world. But some of the things that people do in the Arctic can prepare people for these regime shifts, or they can build resilience to these types of regime shifts, which is what we call these types of surprises. So dealing with these tipping points is a challenge for development, because they're often quite difficult to predict, and they're often quite difficult to respond to, and it's sometimes at human scales that can be basically irreversible. So these surprises are a problem because they're difficult to anticipate, difficult to cope with, and often with substantial effects. So you want to try and avoid them rather than adapt to them, but avoiding them is something you have to think about by building more safe places to be rather than just avoiding going to the edge, because you don't know where the edge is and it's often changing. Just to summarize this is saying that from the past, we know there's many different types of ecological surprise that vary in their scale, their impact, and their certainty. We also know that as people are reweaving the Earth in the Anthropocene, connecting different places together in new ways with greater intensity and increasing speed, that we are expecting more and more of these things to occur. Living in the Anthropocene means living with surprise. And to live and develop a prosperous planet in the Anthropocene, we need to think about that we're going to have to be prepared for unexpected, truly novel surprises, things that we don't even think are possible. And we need to develop the capacity or the resilience to cope with things that we don't know what they're going to be. So thank you.